All right, this next video addresses art and architecture related to Hinduism, starting at around 500 AD or CE, and going into the medieval period. We'll be looking at defining some of the attributes and ways of recognizing the different Hindu deities, some of the stories related to these deities, and then thinking about seeing them in sculpture, mostly relief sculpture, and then examining examples of Hindu architecture as well, and recognizing what different regions of India we can identify from seeing different architectural features. So starting off with some of the basics of Hinduism, it is a very complex religion and belief system, very hard to define because there are many deities, but it is based in the principles of the Vedas, so going all the way back to those ancient texts that we talked about just after the discussion of the Indus Valley. So after the Indus Valley civilization falls, then we have the presence of these Vedas, introducing some of the concepts of samsara, the idea of a cycle of life, death and rebirth. This concept was also discussed in relation to Buddhism, and this idea of karma, one's actions and beliefs, and how you can gain merits and how this will help you in perhaps your next life. In Hinduism, however, it is deeply connected to the idea of the caste system and the idea of the order of society, and that the caste system helps to bring about this order and that everyone's kind of in their correct place. The caste system ensured that you had the correct number of people kind of doing all the different jobs, and also this idea that if you do have a cycle of life, this concept of samsara, there's this possibility of being reborn into a higher caste. In the image below, I'm showing the highest caste, the Brahmin, the priestly caste, which was a very high-level caste, as I've already mentioned, that could engage in certain actions to worship these Hindu deities and were able to lead certain ceremonies. There were a lot of ideas of pollution, meaning that it was really important to be clean before entering into a Hindu temple, so the removal of one's shoes, for example, washing, but also the idea that the higher you were up on the caste system, the more kind of clean you were considered. You weren't an untouchable, which would be at that lowest level. And so this also, it required a lot of food restrictions, and so food for the Brahmin caste, for example, would be very strict versus for a different caste. But there still was a lot of restriction and recommendations in terms of avoiding meats and avoiding eggs and things like that. However, milk products were generally considered okay. So again, this is a representation of a Brahmin engaged in a ritual, and then this is worshippers engaged in what's called Linga Puja, which is the worship of the Shiva Linga, which is a representation of the god Shiva or the deity Shiva. So moving into some of those deities, Shiva is generally seen as the destroyer god, but also regenerator. So you have this idea of destruction and regeneration with Shiva. Shiva is probably the most popular of the gods. He's considered incredibly powerful. He has many attributes that we see, and we'll see a very famous representation of Shiva as the Lord of the Dance, Shiva Nataraja. Vishnu is known as the preserver of the universe. We'll also see scenes of him associated with creation, and we'll also see who his consort is, which is Lakshmi. And then we also have the goddess Devi. So the goddess will take multiple forms. We have, for example, Durga, Kali, Parvati, Uma, so all these different goddesses that are often paired with Shiva, and yet take on these different aspects, whether they're more ferocious or more loving, and we'll talk about that as we're looking at some of the artworks. So gods in Hinduism take on multiple forms. These are known as avatars. Sometimes they can take the form of animals. Hindu religion is classified as pantheism. There's actually many types of classifications for Hinduism, but one version is pantheism, with this idea that there are multiple manifestations of a divine universal spirit, which is known as Brahman. So thinking about Shiva, that very important deity, this destroyer and regenerator, most of these gods are given what's called a vehicle, and so his vehicle is the bull Nandi, and he is married to Parvati, although sometimes she's identified as Uma. Here she's shown as Parvati. This is a sculpture in the LA County Museum of Art. So you see him with Parvati, so Shiva is here with his matted hair piled on top of his head, covered with lots of jewelry. He has a smooth body with a soft belly, similar to Parvati over here. She has some of that kind of fertile curvaceousness that we've seen before in Indian art. And then we can see that bull Nandi, this joyous bull, down below. You can see the visual richness of these sculptures, how they tend to be full of lots of visual information. Moving on to our first key work, this is Vishnu from the Deogarh temple, dating to about 530. So Hinduism is the most popular religion in India today, and right around this time, you really see a turn away from Buddhism, and right around this time, meaning around 530 CE or AD, you see this growth in popularity of Hinduism. This is becoming the main religion that individuals in India are following, and Buddhism is really falling out of favor. Buddhism really rejected ideas of the caste society, some of the food taboos that we talked about earlier. And so it's interesting how you kind of have these two opposing forces or two opposing religions, even though that concept of death and rebirth we see in both examples. You do have some significant differences between the two. And the Buddha really rejected a lot of the aspects of the Vedas, such as the caste system, or the ideas reinforced in the Vedas, such as the caste system. But looking into this particular image, which really marks a moment where Hinduism is becoming very popular in India, you can see Vishnu here reclining on the serpent Ananta, who symbolizes this primordial sea. So kind of this moment of Vishnu dreaming the world into creation. So Vishnu is here resting. His consort Lakshmi is giving him a nice little foot rub, which I always enjoy. Of course, these male gods are always represented as much larger than the female gods, so that's always something important to note, and a clear marker of gender difference. It was said that while this was occurring, Brahma, the creator god, emerges from the navel of Vishnu, and so you see this lotus blossom. So again, that continuity between the lotus in Hinduism and in Buddhism. You see the lotus emerging with the four-headed god Brahma at the top. And often there's a discussion of these three main gods in Hinduism: Vishnu, the preserver; Shiva, the destroyer and regenerator; and then Brahma, the creator. So we've already seen a couple of very significant gods. You can see figures surrounding at the base and up at the top, and then you can see Ananta's kind of large serpent head going around the figure of Vishnu. He's wearing a crown, lots of jewelry, similar to Shiva, but his matted hair is often not quite as dramatic. Shiva also often has a representation of the Ganges River, which he was said to have received into his matted hair and kind of protected the people from the ferocious quality of this massive and important river. So we were talking about Devi and the idea that she takes many forms, including Lakshmi, who we just saw in the previous relief sculpture. She's linked to wealth and beauty. And then there's also Parvati and Durga, who we'll see in a few minutes. Durga, who's linked to righteous fury. Parvati, who we see here, again, a very curvy, smooth body, heavily adorned. Parvati is linked to her son Ganesh, who is this very important and very popular god with the elephant head. You've probably seen him before. There's many stories as to how he got this, but the general story goes that Parvati created him on her own, and then there was a moment where she was bathing and Ganesh was was blocking or protecting the door or the entryway, and Shiva arrives. And he's very frustrated by the fact that Ganesh is blocking the door. So he chops off his head and kills him, or tries to kill him. And Parvati, of course, is so angered, and Shiva says that he will replace the head with whatever being he sees next, and the being he sees first is an elephant. So he takes that head and makes it part of Ganesh, and so he's so easily recognizable. Ganesh is linked to prosperity. If you see him, you often see him at the entry to a temple, or often adorned lots of Hindu temples. Even if he isn't the main deity of the temple, lots of offerings are given to him, sweets and money. And he's seen as a god who removes obstacles. So if you're facing any challenges or you're starting a new project, Ganesh is a good god to refer to. We're going to start off with the Pallava Empire and think about the site of Mamallapuram. And so as we go down to Mamallapuram and we're thinking about the time of about the 7th century, we're going to think about the landscape of this particular site, which is dotted with huge boulders, huge granite boulders. And this became a prime sculpting material for the artists of this site. And so we're going to start off with a cave dedicated to Durga, the Durga cave here at Mamallapuram. So you can see this massive granite boulder that they've dug into, creating this cave form. And we've already talked about in Buddhism, caves were very important, and caves remain important in Hinduism as well. When you enter the cave, you get this dramatic relief sculpture, very large, 7 feet, a rock cut relief, just cut directly into the living rock, where Durga is killing the bull demon. And generally we see Durga having already defeated the bull demon, but this is a moment prime, right in the action. So we see Durga encountering the bull demon. She's on her lion vehicle, which you see here, and she has her crew with her, her entourage, and again, filled with visual information, really adding to this moment of impending violence that's about to happen. And any viewer would know that Durga was going to come out on top. So this is just another view. You see Durga with her crown going into battle, ready for action, and the bull demon kind of moving in the other direction away from Durga, who's coming towards her. So this goddess of righteous fury. Moving on to the great relief at Mamallapuram. This is a massive boulder again that has probably had a cleft in it originally, and so this large relief sculpture was represented. So here you can see the descent of the Ganges with a rock cut cave on the side. We're not 100% sure that this is the iconography, the descent of the Ganges, but that's what I'll present to you. There are many theories in different books and in online articles, so you can explore those. But what I love about this is I was trying to find an image where you could really see water moving down that cleft to give you that sense of what a river would look like as it's coming down from the heavens. I couldn't find that exactly, but I did find an image where you can see the water, what's left of the water dripping down. You could think about monsoon season in southern India and how the relationship with water and rivers flooding and things like that. So rivers are generally seen as very sacred in India, and so if this does represent the descents of the Ganges, this is obviously a much sunnier day, different image. You can get that sense of everyone rushing to see this moment when the Ganges is coming down, and so we have Shiva overseeing this. Remember, we talked about how he received the Ganges into his matted hair. You can see Apsaras, holy figures, rushing to see this key moment. You can see Bhagaratha, this great king who brought the Ganges, who's here in a pose of an ascetic. So we can talk about that in just a minute. You can also see a snake king, Nagaraja, and queen, Nagarini, as well as indications of representations of temple architecture. But I just love the energy. You can see these individuals rushing towards the center. So zooming in, you can see that king and queen, that snake king and queen, who we see both in Hindu and Buddhist sculpture. And then you can also see the temple form, and along the Ganges River there are certain areas where there are tons of temples dedicated to Shiva, and then you can see the ascetic up here and other ascetics showing their belief by holding this very difficult pose. So you can see this figure very slender with his arms raised, and this is something that some individuals continue to do. It's essentially you hold your arms up until they become withered and incredibly thin. But it is supposed to be a sign of devotion. And there's often a question about this cat that's down in the bottom, which people who love cats, this is always very popular, but this cat at the bottom that's holding this pose, and is this some way of kind of poking fun at those who are false ascetics, those who claim to be doing these kind of extreme things like not eating a lot or restricting their diet or holding these difficult poses, but are they really following through on what they say they're doing? And then you can see Shiva very large right here. The last site that we're going to look at Mamallapuram is the Shore Temple, which is a site dedicated to Vishnu. There's an image of Vishnu at the bottom. And so there's now this large kind of protective border that keeps the waves from entering into the temple. But originally the waves, the water would have entered into the temple and would have bathed this figure of Vishnu with regular water baths. And so the figure itself has eroded over time because obviously as water washes over this figure, a lot of the details have been lost. And so the theory is this is supposed to refer back to that idea of Vishnu having that dream. Let me go back to that image we saw where he's laying on Ananta, the serpent, this cosmic serpent that's symbolizing this primordial ocean that where he's dreaming the world into existence, where Brahma is also coming to fruition. So it's a really interesting case of using the natural resources, using the natural materials that are there to essentially recreate an important story related to a god. And so they've literally used the fact that they're right on the shore to recreate this idea of the primordial ocean that Vishnu is sleeping upon. There's some questions. Here's just another view. There's some question as to why Ananta is not there. So has Ananta been kind of washed away? Is there another way of referring to Ananta? But anyways, that's the most likely interpretation, that it refers back to that kind of dream of Vishnu as he's reclining in the base of this temple. And just to show you, this is where Vishnu is if we look at a plan. So I have this question of the environmental context and the importance of the meaning to the sculpture. And so obviously, as I've already discussed, the idea of the ocean waves coming over Vishnu refer to his dream on the ocean. So looking at an example of another cave, looking at the site of Elephanta in Western India, dating slightly before the time of the artwork of Mamallapuram, more from around the time of the other relief sculpture that we were looking at of Vishnu. But this shows the importance and significance of Shiva and the power of Shiva. So this is a great cave that is dedicated to Shiva. It includes a chamber for the Shiva Linga, which is the cosmic pillar that symbolizes the regenerative powers of Shiva. It also represents other figures of Shiva, but this is one of the most famous. It's a multi-headed representation of Shiva that's 18 feet tall. So you have a fierce aspect of Shiva, serene, and also thinking about Shiva's selfhood. There's an implied top portion, which would be another head of Shiva, which would be esoteric mysticism, and a wrathful element of Shiva along the back. So just this idea of multiple heads and often multiple arms that we see with Hindu gods. Another, just giving you a sense of scale, I have found some other images where you have Shiva and Parvati, and then figures nearby to give you a sense of scale. And then you can just see the three-headed or implied five-headed figure of Shiva from Elephanta in the back. Moving on to the Chola dynasty, which was very powerful, again, in southern India, and then you can see some of the subordinates that they controlled moving into Southeast Asia. But what the Chola dynasty is most famous for is what we call Chola bronzes. And so these Chola bronzes were produced in large numbers, and they're very popular. We see them now in a lot of museums. And so these were often paraded in procession. So the way we see them today is not the way we would have seen them originally. They would have been adorned with flowers, with a beautiful costume, with jewelry, with other types of offerings. And that's something that we often see in Hindu temples today. We see offerings of sweets and fruit and other desirable things. People would often say that for all, certain offerings should be made on a regular basis, even after they were deceased, like ghee, which is clarified butter. You can also see things like milk and oils that were made as offerings. So in any case, we're seeing this as missing some of its ceremonial offerings and obviously missing the fact that it would have been paraded, but it still is a very energetic sculpture. So this is one of the most famous types of representations of Shiva as Lord of the Dance, Shiva Nataraja, dating to around 1100. There are many, many representations of Shiva as Lord of the Dance. Thinking about some of the symbols, you can see a little drum here. You could see a flame. You can see that idea of kind of similar to the halo that we saw with the Buddha. So we'll talk about this kind of circle of flames. And then you can see a small figure underneath Shiva's foot. And there's a wonderful sense of motion and dynamism here. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So thinking about Buddhist iconography, are there any connections? So I just wanted to point out the fact that the mudras, so we have some of the same mudras, like the have no fear gesture. So it's just important to think about any kind of overlap. So going through the iconography, you can see that you have this cosmic circle of time, the idea of samsara, the idea of death and rebirth, surrounded by flames, the idea of destruction that's linked with Shiva. So you see the flame in one of the four hands, also the have no fear gesture, so hand like this. The hand drum is this constant beat of maintenance. So the kind of maintenance of the universe. The hand down is supposed to be a wish-granting gesture. So often when you come to see a divine image or an image representing the divine, you're making some kind of wish. So this is to indicate that perhaps your wish will be granted. And then Shiva is crushing this figure that's often thought to be a symbol of ignorance. So Shiva crushing ignorance. But this small figure, this dwarf, is gazing up at him kind of in amazement because Shiva is such a wondrous figure, and so he's often represented as kind of smiling and looking very happy. And whenever I go and see these in museums with my students, this is what they're always looking for. They're like, where's that little figure representing ignorance down below? So moving on to temple architecture, we're going to identify some of the stylistic differences between temple architecture in North and South India. So both North and South Indian temples facilitate darshan, which is Sanskrit for sacred gaze. So the main objective of Hindu pilgrimage is this darshan, which is the seeing and being seen by the divine form in its image. So you go into a temple looking for the image of the divine. And there's a belief that the god occasionally, especially on special holidays or special festival days, the god will descend and inhabit the image. So there is this idea that you are really seeing the divine form. Let's look at Khajuraho, which is in central North India, where we're going to see some examples of very famous examples of northern temple architecture. So this is the Kandariya Mahadeva, which is a temple dedicated to Shiva. There's no outer wall, but the temple is on a very large base or platform. You have very linear towers that are ringed by small towers, and then a quite extensive sculptural program with many themes, including Mithuna couples, which are these loving couples. And that's what this temple has become most famous for, these very erotic scenes that we see on this temple. The temple itself is very much that tradition of the axis mundi, connecting the heaven and the earth. It also has a very mountainous form, so this idea of the gods inhabiting in a mountainous space, which it was said that Shiva did. The architecture itself is very heavy. It doesn't have a lot of windows. It's not very open. So it has this kind of monumentality to it. And it seems similar to entering into a real cave. And we've already seen the idea of carving into living rock to create this idea of a cave. So you would enter into the temple. Usually there's kind of an assembly hall. So you see that here. And then a womb chamber, not room, womb. And so you're entering into the womb chamber, and with a Shiva temple, that's often where you'd encounter the linga, and that's what you would see here. Or sometimes in other temples, you would see an actual image of the divine. And the divine usually has very large eyes, so you're looking at it, it's looking at you, you're looking at it. And so the large eyes facilitate darshan. Here are some of those figures from the extensive sculptural program, and also those loving couples, those Mithuna couples. So we do encounter a lot of gods and goddesses, Ganesha, Vishnu, Lakshmi, but what this temple is most famous for are these figures in sexual union, or these loving couples. So we see some pretty inventive sexual positions here. Here you see a lot of acrobatic poses. You can see it gets pretty creative. It involves animals. So what is the meaning of these erotic scenes? What is going on here? And so a couple of interpretations that have been put forth: the idea of sexual intercourse as a metaphor for oneness with God. The couples in intercourse are put on some temples as magic to protect the monument from danger. We would often call this apotropaic, the idea of warding off evil. Many erotic reliefs at Khajuraho are placed at areas of juncture, so between the temple towers. So some people think it's kind of a pun on juncture or crevices, that kind of thing. And then also the idea of tantric. So tantric was a practice that was somewhat popular at the time. So the artist or patron is commenting, perhaps cynically, on specific tantric practices of the time, which involved going against traditional kind of regulation, so engaging in more taboo behavior, which often included the consumption of liquor. So just some possibilities, but we're still looking into it. Okay. This is an example of southern temple architecture. So we were just looking at central, northern, and now we're looking at southern. And this is linked to the Chola dynasty. So we're now back to the Chola dynasty. And this is the Rajarajeshwara temple. It's in Thanjavur, which is in southern India. It was consecrated right around 1000. So this is generally considered medieval temple architecture, what we've been looking at Khajuraho, and then also at Thanjavur, what we're looking at here. So this is often referred to as medieval. It was built by a king named Rajaraja I, who ruled right around 1000, and it was built in gratitude for his many victories in battle. And so Shiva's role as destroyer of forts was emphasized in this particular temple. So let's think about the features of southern India temple architecture. You have a walled complex with a monumental entrance gateway. The individual structures are more separated, whereas in the north you tend to see what appear to be multiple structures kind of smushed together. Structures rest directly on the ground rather than on those high platforms. There's often a pyramidal tower that's crowned by an octagonal capstone, and these capstones are one of the clear markers of southern temple architecture. Not always, but often. The niches often house deities, but not generally the extensive frieze programs that we saw at the Kandariya Mahadeva in Khajuraho just previously. So that's something to think about. As we enter into the temple, we see images of Shiva. We see Nandi, the vehicle of Shiva. We also see some images of Rajaraja I. Here we see him with his teacher, looking very similar to some of the attributes of the gods themselves, with those mounted, with those hairstyles very much piled on their head, heavily adorned with jewelry, things like that. So here just showing you an image thinking about south versus north, so southern versus northern. You can especially identify those capstones in those separated buildings. And here's just one of my, little quizzes where you could try to figure out what style architecture it is. So A is northern. Southern, you can see that capstone again, we're in the south, and this is northern because you're seeing those Mathuna couples and those extensive frieze programs. So this one was pretty easy, but hopefully you got it. And I just asked the question, is access to images important to encourage religious devotion? So it's important to note that Hinduism is a very, very iconic religion. It emphasizes representing the gods, as you've probably noticed throughout this lecture. So as art historians, we really like Hinduism because they really like representing their deities. So just this idea of actually seeing the gods and the idea of darshan being very, very helpful. Just as a final image, because in the next lecture we're going to think about stereotypes of Asian culture and how some aspects of the culture have been misinterpreted. And the goddess Kali is one of these goddesses who has often been misinterpreted, most famously in an Indiana Jones movie, and the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So we'll talk about that a little bit next time. But Kali, who's often encountered as looking so fearsome and so ferocious and so intimidating. And that was one of her purposes. She was supposed to be an intimidating goddess, but one of the main aspects of her is as a mother. And so we think about her as this incredibly protective figure. So we see her here holding weapons, looking very strong and powerful, looking intimidating. In illustrations, we often see her engaged in killing individuals or anyone who would pose a threat, but she is this destroyer of negative forces, and she is this kind of ultimate protective mother. So even though as outsiders we might not always understand what we're seeing, it's important to understand the full context, and so we'll talk about that more in the next video.